The bison, the American buffalo, the bison's population in the wild, used to be estimated at about 30 million individuals. But when the Europeans occupied the Americas, they started to drive it out everywhere and committed the largest animal extermination operation in all of history. Until the year 1884, its numbers in the wild dropped to just 300 individuals at most. And there is a famous photo taken at the end of the 19th century, standing on a huge pile resembling a pyramid entirely made up of bison skulls. So, what's the story, and why did the American army wipe out the bison like that? The bison is a large type of cattle that was widespread in enormous numbers across the grasslands and prairies, stretching from Alaska in Northern America all the way to the Gulf of Mexico in the far south, and it was considered the largest mammal in the entire continent of North America. And the Native Americans depended on it as a main resource for many things. You could say that it was, for them, like a treasure. First, they ate its meat. Its summer hide was used for making tents, and its winter skin they used to make blankets and winter clothing. Even the bones and horns were used for making tools. And the bison, an animal that used to reproduce in enormous numbers. Its population in the wild ranged from 30 million to 60 million individuals. But despite that, the indigenous people did not hunt it in large quantities. They only hunted as much as they needed, and they dealt with it as an important part of their culture. Until now, everything was fine and there was no problem at all. But problems would begin to appear with the arrival of the Europeans. As usual, in the 1850s, the Europeans were tightening their grip on the Americas and had settled there. And the United States had declared its independence decades before. But despite that, the indigenous people were still there, and there was a large group of them in Central and Western America, specifically in the area of the Great Plains, and that's why they were called the Plains Indians. By the way, the word Indians is just European arrogance. These people are called the indigenous peoples. It's just that when the Americas were discovered by Europeans, according to them, they thought that they had arrived in India, so they called them Indians. They didn't know that this was a new land at the time. Anyway, those Plains Indians were a headache for the Europeans, because the Europeans wanted to gather all the indigenous people in that region and imprison them in a small village where they lived, and then the Europeans would plunder the lands and steal them just like they stole the ones before, and they had something at that time called the dream of American expansion westward, and that it was their destiny to colonize these lands, and the same broken record that we all know. But every time they tried to enter the plains areas, the Native Americans would prevent them, fight them, and inflict upon them heavy losses, especially since the terrain of these areas is complicated, and they are plains that they know by heart, and they were an armed group skilled at horseback riding. And the Americans, at that time, had just come out of a civil war, so they were not ready for any other battles. That is why they thought of a remarkably devious plan to achieve their goals. The commander of the American army at that time, William Sherman, told them, "Aren't the Indians of the plains dependent on the bison for almost everything?" They replied, "Yes." He said to them, "It's simple. We have nothing to do with the Indians. We will eliminate the bison itself, and that way we will starve them and force them to ask us for help, especially since the Native Americans at that time had no contact with the outside world, unlike the Americans, who were importing everything they needed from Europe." And indeed, the American army gave the green light to thousands of European hunters, that they exterminated the bison, and even though there were treaties between the American army and the tribal chiefs that prevented hunters from entering their lands, the Americans, as usual, did not abide by the agreements, but were even protecting the hunters and giving them weapons and ammunition to hunt with. In addition, the American cavalry also got involved and started to exterminate the bison themselves. When the natives objected and human rights organizations intervened, a symbolic decision was issued in the American Congress in the year 18, which stated that hunting bison was illegal. But the American president at the time, Ulysses Grant, objected to the decision, canceled it, and told them, "Whoever wants to hunt, let him hunt." In fact, the Americans at the time began to promote the idea of recreational hunting and told Europeans, "If anyone wants to come and hunt bison for fun, they're welcome." In fact, they started sending invitations to athletes and celebrities in Europe so that they could come and hunt bison in America, as if it were a festival. Thousands of bison were being killed daily, to the extent that in 1876, a European hunter killed 5,800 bison in just 2 months, which is about 100 bison a day, and the issue did not stop there. The Americans noticed that the leather industry was in high demand in Europe, and so they promoted the idea of benefiting from python skin. And this, in turn, increased poaching activities. And among the most heinous practices they did was that the hunters would shoot the python, then take the skin and throw the meat on the ground until it rots and nobody benefits from it. In fact, some hunters would put poison in the meat so that nobody would eat it, and if a wolf came to eat it, it would die too, and they would take the wolf's fur and leave its corpse too. And of course, if any of the indigenous people found the meat and wanted to eat it, they would face the same fate. After the meat decomposed, the hunters would collect the bones and the remaining skulls as a matter of pride or to grind them and use them as fertilizer. This is the time when the famous photo we talked about at the beginning of the episode was taken. The Plains Indians, meanwhile, saw the Americans exterminating their main animal. At first, they didn't understand why they were doing this, nor did they understand why the Europeans were no longer attacking them as before. But with time, of course, the picture became clear. However, unfortunately, the indigenous people realized after it was too late, and the number of bison dropped significantly, and they could no longer find anything to eat. By the late 1880s of the 19th century, the number of pythons in the wild came to range from 300 to 500 individuals. In fact, some statistics say that their numbers reached as low as 100 individuals at most. And so, their vile strategy, they succeeded and defeated the Plains Indians. After the Plains Indians were deprived of their food sources, they were forced to submit to the Americans because of hunger, leaving their lands and going to live in areas from which they were not allowed to leave, in return for the people who occupied the land providing food. And then European companies entered the lands, took control of them and their resources, and created tourist and recreational parks in the places where the Plains Indians used to live. Among the things that are ironically funny is that after the Americans eliminated the Plains Indians and restricted their residence, they started saying, "It's a shame that the numbers of bison have decreased so much. This shouldn't happen. People, this is not right. Animals also have rights." And they started to act as moral police, as usual, and began banning hunting and arresting anyone who hunted the animal illegally, and made the usual film they make with every disaster. And in the end, they turned the bison from an animal that bred in huge numbers into an animal threatened with extinction. But fortunately, some wealthy Americans at that time kept some bison on their private farms. And then the American government took them, along with the few remaining ones in the wild, and put them in large reserves and started to take care of them for years. For a long time until their numbers started to increase again. And now they have reached about 500,000 individuals. Of course, that's nothing compared to their original numbers, but in the end, they were saved from the risk of extinction. Afterwards, they released groups of them into the plains so they could blend with wildlife again. As for the python problem, it's somewhat as for the problem of the indigenous people, there hasn't been any news or updates. But that's it, we're done.